Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 102. And so what am I spotlighting this week? Well, if you had seen my album of the week episode for Gillen's Future Shock, well, at the end I did of course announce what was going to be this week's album spotlight. And here it is. Again, from the title to the artwork, yes, I am spotlighting the third full-length album from, of course, one of my favorite German metal bands, that is Breaker from Accept, which was originally released on March 16th, 1981. And since, as far as this seems to be, that on Tuesday, which will be tomorrow, it will be reaching its 40th anniversary. Because of, again, we are in the month of March, so we're, again, just tomorrow it will reach its 40th anniversary. So that's one of the other reasons why I'm spotlighting it this week. Again, ahead of celebrating its 40th anniversary. Again, 40 years to this classic third album, which for sure ending up kind of kicking the band off in really some of the best ways, and it really led to two of or at least maybe three of the biggest selling records I think that this band has ever seen. But this album for sure is what really kicked things off for them. Even though it wasn't their debut album, because their debut album, which was self-titled, came out in 1979, it did, of course, the thing is, but it was a rocky start in a way, and then I'm a Rebel, which I'll then somewhat briefly talk about, and then this album. But this was the beginning of a lot of the really good things for this band, from Wolf Hoffman to, of course, Udo Dirkschneider. So Breaker, where do we really begin? So, after 1980's second album, I'm a Rebel, the band, of course, were, especially Wolf Hoffman, were not really fond of the resulting, just the resulting piece in that album, the whole end thing. They didn't, the whole finished record. They were not really happy with it. And if you ask, of course, Wolf Hoffman, and a lot of the interviews, he whenever asked about his whole opinion or his thoughts on I'm a Rebel as a whole, he definitely said that it wasn't really the album that they wanted to make. It was more of the pressure from the record label to basically ask them to do more of a radio-friendly kind of album. And if you're not really familiar with I'm a Rebel, you almost can at least agree with that, because of, while the debut album was definitely not a bad record, it's not as bad as many people seem to make it out to be. I actually it's one of those albums that's actually grown on me. But again, their debut album kind of sits there along with the first Saxon, or the first Judas Priest, or even at times the first AC/DC album. It was a very different sounding record. It wasn't what you would have expected from the later album, especially beginning with Breaker here, which I'll then beginning to at least talk about here. But we have to, of course, again talk about I'm a Rebel, how they ended up getting to Breaker. So they were not really happy with the finished result. Of course, though it did give them a very much a concert staple to this day, that being the title track for I'm a Rebel. The track I'm a Rebel, which was not Accept's song. It was, and of course, since then it's pretty much is now common knowledge that it was a track that was presented to them from, the thing is, I think the label wanted Accept to do, the kind of come up with a hit, at least a more of a known track or some sort, but they somehow got in contact with, of course, Alex Young, who of course was the youngest of the Young brothers, he came in and he pretty much just gave the band I'm a Rebel. He wrote the track, and it was originally was supposed to have been given to AC/DC, but somehow there's still been rumors that there is a recording of AC/DC doing I'm a Rebel, and it could very well be in the vault. It's been somewhat rumored that, or it could be considered an urban legend, that it was recorded, that at least AC/DC's version was recorded during the Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap album, or at least that era of 1976. But along with maybe like Cold Hearted Man and Dirty Eyes and Love at First Feel and those songs, it's somewhat been rumored, but there's not really a whole lot of, at least not a whole lot of accurate or really solid evidence that might say so. So at this point, it just seems to be that it was supposed to have been given to AC/DC, but they might have jammed it, but they just didn't feel like it would have been good enough for at least one of their albums. And instead, Alex Young, basically years later, then finally contacted by at least one of the record labels. I don't think it was Brain. I think it was one of the labels that actually had released I'm a Rebel, at least the European pressing or whatnot of it, that contacted Alex Young to then come in and present the track to accept, at least in 1979, at least. Because there is a rehearsal recording of it, and it's very much been said that it's, or at least, there's not really a whole lot of information surrounding the actual recording that is surfaced of the track I'm a Rebel. The early version that was recorded in 1979, someone said it was just Alex Young playing the track, and then some of, apparently then there's a lot of other rumors that it is accept with Alex Young and possibly a very drunk Bon Scott. So the fact that alone actually think that Bon Scott is sharing a room with Udo Dirkschneider is absolutely mind-blowing. So, very cool. But again, that's only rumors. There's really not a whole lot of concrete evidence or concrete facts or so on that really puts in on that. There really isn't. Still though, again, it was given to them. They record it for the album. It actually turned out to be the title of the album, or it was self-titled originally, because I'm a Rebel was going to be the first album that was going to be released at least worldwide, especially in America. So here in America, it got it was just self-titled here in America because of the debut album that was released in '79. It didn't get released here in America, though it has been it has arrived here as imports and so on. So, but it did get the I'm a Rebel title in Europe. So in many ways, this track that was written for them, that was given to them, turned out to be probably one of the biggest songs off the album, and it's the song that seems to be most fondly remembered from that album, and gets the most played. But still, when it comes to the rest of that album, a lot of the members were just very lukewarm towards it. Though I actually think songs like China Lady and Thunder and Lightning were two of the absolute best songs on that album, in my opinion. They were still classic, except, but the title track was what at least what was one that really stayed in the band's set list to this day. It still gets played. I think even Udo still sings the track. So it's a concert staple for the band. It was an iconic track, and it actually helped break them a little bit more into the European market. But that's where we finally then lead into Breaker. Because in right here, in December of 1980 to January of 1981, they were booked to, of course, into Delta Studio, and that's where they began recording Breaker. That's where they finally do. And again, with producer Dirk Steffens, who had produced the previous album, I'm a Rebel. And so he's back here, and this would actually end up being the final album that Dirk Steffens would be producing for Accept. So here they are then finally recording Breaker. And then finally, on March 16th, 1981, it gets released through Brain Records in Germany, and then Polydor as well, the same year, and then finally, I believe a year later, it then got released through, I think, Passport Records in America. So, there you go. Breaker, released in March 16th of 1981, so finally that's where I finally head into the album. This is where finally the discussion, the whole whatever, me just breaking down this album, it finally comes. I finally get to break down this album. That is Breaker from Accept, their third full-length album. So, with Breaker, we are given about 10 songs. So, these 10 songs are, again, it all clocks in at 43 minutes and 51 seconds. So, these 10 songs are Starlight, Breaker, Run If You Can, Can't Stand the Night, Son of a Bitch, which I can't wait to at least discuss, Burning, Feelings, Midnight Highway, Breaking Up Again, and Down and Out. However, though, if you, of course, were here in America, you would have gotten at least somewhat of the same album, and I'll definitely touch on some more of that, but you would have, but the track listing would have been a little bit different, and so let me try and find the track listing for that. So, the track listing for the American pressing on like Passport Records has definitely a slightly rearranged track listing. So let me kind of run this track listing down just for at least this sake, though I'm not going to be showing the artwork, even though it's a slightly switched up artwork with a more generic logo and so on. But the track listing for the Passport pressing of Breaker, which would be the American pressings for this album, basically begin with Midnight Highway, Breaker, Starlight, Breaking Up Again, Burning, Run If You Can, Feelings, Down and Out, Can't Stand the Night, and then finally Son of a Bitch. So there's the altered, rearranged track listing for the American pressings of Breaker. Of course, nowadays when it does get released on CD, I think even here it reverts back to its European track listing. So there you go. All right. So where do I begin with Breaker here? I mean, it's like, while again, when I was briefly talking about I'm a Rebel and how the band was not satisfied with that album, because again, they just felt like they were just putting a lot of pressure at least was being put on them from the record label to make something more radio friendly. They had to basically make an album that would be seen as a hit, so they kind of had to basically fall down to at least the knees of the record label. So they weren't. So what do they do for their third album? Well, they decide to make the album that they wanted to make, and that's just make a straight up heavy metal album. And this was the album that really saw Accept really spread its wings. And the metal wings, that's for sure, because this is the album that really birthed that Accept sound. For me, what also this album, either Restless and Wild, and then Scorpions with either Blackout, or even Animal Magnetism, and I'll even also say, and of course, Love at First Sting, were kind of the albums that really helped shape up that German metal sound. And this album right here from Accept really just helped really birth that true 80s German metal sound. And this album, along with Restless and Wild and Balls to the Wall, for sure, in my opinion, and of course in most people's, is pretty much the trilogy of just great albums from these guys. You can't get any better than that. This is a trilogy of great albums from Accept. Again, Breaker, Restless and Wild, and Balls to the Wall. That was it. Just great slew. Even though they albums like Restless and Wild, Balls to the Wall and Metal Heart were kind of seen as the three of the bigger selling albums, but Breaker was the first of the, again, beginning of some of the just great albums, and everything about this album, it really sits there or up there as one of my favorite albums from these guys. So I mean, just from the opening riffs and so on of Starlight, which does have that sort of new wave or British heavy metal sound to it, but it's just a classic opener. It's a great track. But then finally, what ends up coming next is easily, I've seen some people might say some of the beginnings of that European power metal sound kind of begin with this song too, but the title track, I mean, the whole riff or so on is somewhat inspired by A Light in the Black from Rainbow, because again, Wolf Hoffman was very influenced and inspired by Richie Blackmore and even Uli Jon Roth and those guys, but especially Richie Blackmore, especially if you listen to a lot of his guitar solos on this album. It really began that sort of really neoclassical touch to his guitar playing. But again, in some cases puts him in that same category as guys like Michael Schenker and Uli Jon Roth and Richie Blackmore. And so he's definitely in that same category, and you really get a lot of that. And Breaker is just a early speed metal track, but again, I guess laying the blueprints there as well for the sort of European power metal that bands like Helloween and Gravedigger and Blind Guardian and so on just really took off with, or Scanner. Just great band, just a great stuff here. Just a classic track. Run If You Can. Again, back to sort of, this is definitely one of those really classic sort of accept riffs. It's just that beat that you would end up with getting with us on more of the stuff you would get on like a Restless Wild, like Demon's Night, or even some of the heavier, more mid-pace stuff off of like Balls to the Wall, like Love Child and fucking Balls to the Wall, or just some of those kind of stuff. It really is. Run If You Can, just a fucking good song. And Can't Stand the Night is kind of a ballad. This is actually one of the few ballads, beginning of the few ballads where Udo actually sings, because most of the ballads prior to anything on Breaker, even though I'll get to it, Peter Baltes, or Baltz, whatever his how I'm able to at least pronounce his last name, the bass player, he was usually handling a lot of the more moodier, more melodic, more again more ballady kind of songs from like the self-titled debut album to I'm a Rebel. But Can't Stand the Night was the beginning of where Udo was going to take, at least from here on out, would take up at least the duties of at least providing vocals for a lot of the ballads. He would do vocal duties for a lot of the ballads from here on out. But Can't Stand the Night, I don't know if I can still call it a pure ballad. It's probably a power ballad as well. It's a very moodier track, but I like it. It's definitely one of those songs that really grew on me, and it's a great track. So Can't Stand the Night, it's fucking fantastic. It's a great song. Again, I kind of consider Accept be in that sort of same category as like Scorpions or UFO, and even Judas Priest, especially early Judas Priest, where they knew how to actually craft a ballad that at least has sort of fluent and very natural, that doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel convoluted. It sounds really, it comes from the heart. And Can't Stand the Night is kind of in there, and we'll eventually get to it, at least Breaking Up Again. But there we go. But after this, well, I guess they couldn't stand it anymore. That's when we finally get to Son of a Bitch, which ends at least the first half of this album. And if you want any more of an answer on how they felt about the record label basically overriding their whole idea, their whole plans on what their second album was going to be, their whole answer and their message to the record label is pretty much all summed up in Son of a Bitch. And this is one of and in many ways, this is considered probably the first, maybe one of the first ever most vulgar, most really aggressive, pissed off track you probably would have ever heard from any band, because of, again, when I say vulgar, it's fucking vulgar. The language that is just that's added to this song. I mean, if the lines "cocksucking motherfucker, I was right" doesn't hit you, if it doesn't give you any hint, that doesn't do anything for you, then I don't know what else would, because of there's just other lines on this song that is just absolutely absolutely batshit nuts. I mean, of course, you got here it is. Let me try again. You got "son of a bitch, kiss my ass," "son of a bitch, you asshole," and just this whole thing is just it's a complete it's a complete anti-message to, or just a whole message to the record label, to even just the music industry in itself. I always thought it was about a breakup of some sort, but really, after the more I start looking into a lot of it, and everything starts, it really does sound like it is an absolute middle finger to the music industry, and how they are with censorship and whatnot. And the thing is, this song was also pretty controversial. I mean, of course, why wasn't gonna be a factor. I mean, come on. They really expected that this wasn't going to cause a stir in their own country, even in Britain or America. It wasn't going to, and it kind of did. I don't know. I don't know whether or not if this song was actually part of the Filthy 15 from the PMRC in the mid '80s. But again, this track is just it did, because of it. When the album was released and they decided to add in lyrics, they didn't put the lyrics for this track on there. They even scratched this song out on the liners on the insert sleeve. They slashed the track off because of they basically didn't want the label to even hear the or at least see the lyrics. If anything, how they found out was when they put the record on. So that's how that happened, and it caused such a stir that they were forced to actually record a censored version, which then would somewhat now be dubbed as Born to Be Whipped, which that version would actually would replace the versions on the American pressings for the album. I think even the British pressings as well. It would this version of the censored version, where it's titled Born to Be Whipped, would replace that. So a lot of the American pressings of at least of Breaker, at least as far as it's been said, I don't know. There's a lot of rumors that there are a few pressings of at least a few American pressings of Breaker that actually contains the full uncensored version, the one where it is Son of a Bitch and not Born to Be Whipped. But for the most part, it did. And I know that the Castle Classics CD copy from 1992 does contain the Born to Be Whipped track, which is in the censored version of Son of a Bitch. So they were pressured in doing that. So basically, they had Udo re-record vocals for it, just so they can be able to add it on to at least the most of the other pressings for this album, to at least be able to release it outside of Germany. So it did. It caused quite a bit of stir, but you can't say that it is one of the most, it's maybe people say shocking, but it's still a goddamn infectious song. It's still got a heavy riff. It fits the whole theme of the track. It's a mean motherfucker of a song, and I just love it. So it's definitely and it's a staple. It's a staple in the band's set list. There really has, and I think even Udo, they all still play this track, and it's always the version that is Son of a Bitch and not Born to Be Whipped. So just again, it really became a classic staple there, along with like Breaker and so on. So finally, that of course ends the first half of this album. So finally, for the second half, we begin with Burning, which After Son of a Bitch is probably a little bit of a kind of a setback, even though I actually really like this song because it's more of a boogie style romp. Very AC/DC like. I really, the more times I've now listened to this riff, it really does sound like, and I know that I guess one of the albums that Wolf Hoffman definitely, when ranking some of his favorite albums, apparently Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap is kind of added it in that list. And I can't help but think of at least that later part of Ain't No Fun Waiting Around to Be a Millionaire, where AC/DC begins to really speed things up. They obviously, Wolf Hoffman seemed to have really taken a lot of the riffs from that latter portion of Ain't No Fun Waiting Around to Be a Millionaire from AC/DC. It's that same boogie riff. It's that same just pacing. The whole composition, it's that whole entire riff and just milked into one song. And it is it's a very classic track, and it also became a very live staple for the band too. So it's a good song. I really do like Burning. It's a fun, catchy track. Feelings, back to be more of a slightly mid-paced song, but it still is a heavy track. It still is good, still sounds like classic, except it's a good track. Midnight Highway is probably the more, I would say next to Burning, because Burning just still had a heaviness to it. It was still rocking. It still had a very rabid feel to it, whereas Midnight Highway is probably a very more, it is definitely more melodic this time around. It is probably another stab at making a more commercial, radio-friendly kind of track. And it's probably one of the reasons why, for the American pressing, it was chosen as the first song instead of Starlight. So it probably is why, because to kind of give a better impression on the American market. But it's a fine song, and it's actually not my favorite on the album. If anything, Midnight Highway could very well be up there as probably my least favorite songs on the album. But it's still a decent song. I can still listen to it. I can still let it play. But it's probably my least favorite song on the album. Breaking Up Again, I'm almost the same thing with, because Breaking Up Again is definitely a ballad, and this is definitely the last ballad where Peter Boltes, the bass player, is actually singing on this track. This is the final one, and it's very similar to all the other ballads that he sang on the previous two albums, but it's still a decent enough song. Finally, though, we get to Down and Out, the very last song, and again, classic, except it's again beginning more of that balls to the wall style heavy riffing. It's still raw sounding, except it's just a great track, and it's a good way to end the album. It's just on a heavy freaking note, and I love it. Just a classic track. So there you go. There is Breaker in most of its glory. This is definitely the album that really began the pretty much that Accept sound. This was the album that really introduced that sound, where Accept really began to really again spread its wings, like I've said. This was where they really kind of created their own sound. They came up with it. This is what was it. It was the beginning of that. Just a good album from beginning to end. And so this album, and then finally following up with an album that actually in many ways would completely catapult them into the hemisphere as being one of the most top German metal bands. That, of course, leads into Restless and Wild. And I can't wait to end up talking about that album, but not just yet. Just, again, let the year pass by until finally when it's right for me to talk about Restless and Wild. So, just great stuff here. So after that, there we go. Breaker, reaching its 40th anniversary. I should definitely also mention that after this album, guitar player George Fisher, he would eventually leave the band, and would be out of the band at least until 1985 when he returned from Metal Heart. So he would be out of the band for at least several years there. So there we go. So, and of course he would then eventually be replaced by Herman Frank, which then would go into like Restless and Wild and Balls to the Wall. So there you go. there is. Again, it's reached its 40th anniversary. If you've got any memories of growing up with this album, any memories, if you have even the same thoughts that you still had when you first heard this song, or if your thoughts have changed about this album, if you have any thoughts, again, leave them in the comments section below. But if you haven't heard this album, don't listen to some of these other reviewers who have reviewed the new album and say that how mediocre that these guys are. Don't. I think, if anything, that is a complete bullshit, and I think it's a very elitist to actually pull. I'm sorry. It is fucking stupid. These guys are definitely one of the top, for me personally, one of the top tier German metal bands, and Breaker was the beginning of that classic Accept sound. And I think you definitely should check this album out, because if you like albums like, for example, Restless and Wild or Balls to the Wall, if you like those two albums, I can't see you not liking Breaker if you haven't heard it. I can't see you not. It's a good album. So definitely, I recommend Breaker for sure. It is, in some cases, in Accept's discography, it is kind of an historic album, so it is deserved to be listened to. So there you go. It's a classic album. Next week's album of the week spotlight will be, I'm pulling up my, at least my scheduling. So what's going to be next week's? Wow. Next week is going to be Sounds of Violence by Onslaught, which was my venture in the more modern era. Onslaught, classic British thrash metal. I'll definitely get to talking about that album. And I've got plenty of things to say about that album. So with that, that's where we end things. Hope all of you enjoyed. This is Every Thrasher Sam out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.